Welcome to a special City Club of Cleveland forum. My name is Pete Moore from the Case Western Reserve University. The talk today by Rami Khouri is an event part of a larger year-long series entitled New Perspectives on Muslim and Middle Eastern Societies. This project is managed by the Northeast Ohio Consortium of Middle East Studies, which is a unique collaboration of Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland State University, Kent State University, and recently John Carroll, Hathaway Brown, and Oberlin. Our media partners in this project are the Civic Commons, working here with us today, IdeaStream, and of course the City Club of Cleveland. We have a number of community partners we want to briefly thank: CARE Ohio, the First Church in Oberlin, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, Trinity Cathedral, and Interact Cleveland. For more information on this series, go to theciviccommons.com/issues/new perspectives. Today, we are honored to have Rami Khouri, who is the director of the Issam Ferris Institute of Public Policy at the American University of Beirut, and is a broadly published journalist in the Middle East who works for the Beirut Daily Star newspaper. With further ado, I turn it over to Rami. Thank you.
That's obviously Rami, and I'm Dan Moulthrop from the Civic Commons, and we're going to do this as kind of a conversation, followed by your questions answered by Rami. We had the great pleasure of hearing Rami speak last night at the Kent State University School of Journalism, and it was just really illuminating. He was in conversation with Kent State University professor of political science, Josh Stacker, talking about, at that point, what we missed, the stories that we missed. And today, the topic is about understanding the causes and consequences of the world's newest species, free, democratic, sovereign Arabs, which is the title that Rami selected for the talk. So let me ask you first then, Rami Khouri, what are the causes and consequences of the world's newest species?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here. Is the mic working?
The mic is working.
Yeah, there you go. So first of all, thank you to the City Club, the Civic Forum, the consortium, all the sponsors and donors and people who've assisted. It's a delight for me to be here and to visit Cleveland for the first time. The title means really that we actually have a new human species right now, a new political species, which is free, democratic, and sovereign Arabs. We've never had in the modern Arab world, ever since the Arab world was created after the modern political Arab world, the countries of the Arab world now, that started around World War I or so, we've never had entire countries that were completely living in free and democratic systems where the people themselves actually defined the policies of their governments and held the governments accountable and were able to make decisions based on what the consent of the governed established as the priorities for those countries. We've never had that situation. Now it's starting to happen, and we've seen with this popular revolt starting in Tunisia and then Egypt, Libya, and other countries now being affected, and others where there isn't a big revolt in the street, but there's political pressure within the countries to make the systems more accountable, more democratic, more pluralistic, more open and liberal. And this is an unprecedented development, and that's why I think we need to understand why this happened and what are the consequences, because it's really a historic development with huge implications.
Where are we seeing is it Egypt where this is furthest along? I mean, obviously everything is virtually embryonic at this point, but which nation is emerging as having the population that is the most free, democratic, and sovereign?
It's too early to tell, but obviously Tunisia and Egypt are the two countries that started this process in December, January, and February of that just passed. And Libya then had its revolt and now has been liberated. Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, other countries are in different stages of internal change and stress. And confrontation, and with governments fighting back and people pushing for freedom. So each one will have a different trajectory. The thing that's important to keep in mind about the Arab world is there isn't one Arab world. There are 350 million Arabs, roughly the same number as Europeans, I think. And like Europe, they're divided into many countries with different cultures, different conditions of economic development, different social traditions, different value systems, even in many cases, different languages in some cases. But what brings them together is a sense of being Arab. They all speak some form of classical Arabic, and they're mostly Muslims. They're about 95% Muslims. And they have a shared history, in a way, of sort of a memory of a more glorious past. But otherwise, they're very different, and there's huge differences. So
let me pause for just a second. Chad, with the levels, these are the only two mics we're going to be using for the next 25 minutes or so. So if that helps. Sorry about that, everybody. That was awkward. Go ahead.
So there's a wide range of different conditions and therefore different trajectories of development and transformation all over the region. So we shouldn't think of a single Arab world and one trend defining them all. And we see that already. Libya, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, they're all very different in terms of their political transformations.
You just said something that I think a lot of people don't realize. You referenced the glorious past that lives in the memory of Arabs. And I think mostly Westerners think of Arabs as a subjugated people, living under brutal dictatorships for the most part.
Well, in the modern world, in the last 100 years, most Arab countries, especially in the last 60 years, have lived under, they're not all brutal dictatorships. Some of them are mild dictatorships, some of them are police states, some of them are enlightened monarchies, but none of them are democracies. None of them are societies where the consent of the governed actually defines how policies are made or even what are the national values. But there's a wide range of different systems. But there is this strong pride and sense of feeling demeaned, because what Arabs have experienced in the last 60 years at three levels: their own autocracies and their own mismanagement, corruption, internal problems, which are completely their own problem. At second level is of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the continued humiliation of being defeated by the Israelis, and then the Israelis colonizing and settlements and laying siege to Gaza and imprisoning 10,000 Palestinians, all the things that come out of the Arab-Israeli conflict that are negative. And the third one is relations with the Western world, with these armies that keep coming at us since Napoleon over 200 years ago. We keep getting these waves of armies from Europe and more recently from the United States. And so those three levels of domestic, regional, and global degradation, or even I would call it humiliation, combine to create a sense of people in the Arab world feeling that we're better than this. We don't deserve to live like this. And they remember the past when the Arabs were leaders of science and technology and government and many of the finest human values that sparked the Renaissance, that opened the way to the modern world. Those values were incubated and often created in the ancient Arab Islamic world. And people remember that. So they don't just want to go back to the past, but they're fortified by what the past tells them they are able to achieve as an Arab Islamic culture.
From an Arab perspective, then, the current U.S. forces or UN forces that are involved in any of the conflicts, whether it's Iraq or whether it's potentially or Libya now, this to them is part of a pattern. This is the same as the British in the early part of the 20th century.
That's right. And to be fair, it's important not to exaggerate the sort of criticism of the United States. It's the United States that now tends to lead this kind of militarization in Iraq and Afghanistan. But if you go back and you look at just, say, Qaeda, bin Laden's terrorist group, the birth of Al-Qaeda was due to foreign armies in the Middle East that came from, well, in the Islamic world, the Russian army in Afghanistan. And that was the spark that started the birth of Al-Qaeda. It was then the American army in Saudi Arabia. in the 1990s that created a second push for al-Qaeda's and turning its aim westward at the US and Europe, whereas the initial birth of al-Qaeda was to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just Americans that people complain about, or American army, it's any foreign army that comes into our region or into the Islamic realm and does things that people in their societies feel are predatory or aggressive or unfair to them, and they fight back.
So you've talked about the fact that what we've seen in the last 10 months since last December is not just a moment. It's actually been building for decades and decades. What specifically, though, are the consequences of this revolution, these revolutions?
Well, the consequences, if these revolutions develop into democratic, pluralistic, accountable countries, and there'll be variations among them, but if there is a tendency towards countries where the consent of the governed actually matters, where citizens have certain rights that they can actually exercise, where they feel that they're treated decently by their own power structure, if you get stable, reasonably democratic countries, that's a win-win for everybody. First of all, for the people of those countries. Second of all, for their neighbors, if they're Arab neighbors or non-Arab. Iran, Turkey, and Israel are the three major non-Arab countries in the region. And they will only benefit from having a democratic Arab world. If you look at the trajectory of Turkey in the last 30 or 40 years, the transition of Turkey into a democratic country where the civilians now oversee the military, where the economy is prospering, where Turkey has developed very good relations with most of its neighbors. There's still tensions here and there. You can only win by having more democracies in the Arab world, and therefore that will ultimately impact on, I think, helping the Arab-Israeli conflict find a resolution, and then developing a platform of mutually beneficial ties with the Western world.
The way you talk about it is very refreshing, because you lay it out as if it's a foregone conclusion that democracies will emerge in all of these nations. And yet to watch the news, you don't see that. To watch the news and to hear the American punditocracy talk about it, certainly you hear more often than not, well, Islam is completely incompatible with democracy, so we have to institute it ourselves, or we have to go in there and nation build or something like that. But well, you're saying the complete opposite.
Yes, because if you rely on the American mainstream news media, you should find the closest bus to jump in front of, because American news media coverage of the Arab world is by and large terrible. There are spots of excellence here and there, but by and large it's incomplete. It's ideologically driven, it's emotionally overreacting, it's sensational, focusing on the negative, exaggerating the religious dimension, ignoring the underlying political and social realities, and applying grievous double standards. So the mainstream American media coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict, of the Arab world, of Islamic issues, of any interaction between the US and the Arab world is not something that you should rely on. And therefore you don't get images of what I'm talking about, which is a kind of a normal transition from autocratic governments to more democratic ones. But there will be variations. I'm not saying that every Arab country is going to become like Sweden. Look at the transition after the Soviet Empire fell, and look today, 20 years later, you have some real oppressive democracies, some strong autocracies, dictatorships, and some in between. And I think we'll probably go through that trajectory. The other thing you want to keep in mind is the United States, when it started as a democratic country 25 years ago, whenever it was 230 years ago, 35 years ago now, it was a shining democracy for slave-owning, land-owning white men, and nobody else had any rights. Most of the people in the country had no rights. So you were an imperfect democracy. It took you a civil war and a couple of constitutional crises and all kinds of things until women got the vote in the 1920s, I think, and then another 40 years till black people got the vote to the civil rights movement, and you're still only recently gay people are getting their rights and other people are getting their rights. So democracies take a long time to evolve and really stabilize. And therefore, I think we shouldn't judge what's going on in the Arab world after 5 to 6 months of initial activity. We have to be patient, realistic, and humble, I think, to give them a little time. But all the signs, I think, are very positive. If you look at Egypt and Tunisia, we've had the most experience, all of 7 months. It's pretty positive.
Patient, realistic, and optimistic.
And humble.
And humble.
Yeah. Humility is very important.
Very importantly. But not all Americans have access to watching Al Jazeera English on their cable provider. And not all of us have the time to go seek it out online. And so we're stuck with what we see on CNN. When we see all of Tahrir Square filled with people praying, and then you hear the commentator saying, well, it's clear the Muslim Brotherhood, blah, 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 blah. What should we actually be thinking about? How should we actually read what we're seeing?
Well, the first thing you should do is recognize that what the commentators on American television are saying is not very reliable most of the time. It's like 70% exaggerated, and there's kernels of truth, but by and large, in situations like that where they overreact to anything religious. The second thing is, if you're worried about political people in the public sphere talking the language of religion, then you should be really worried about some of these Republican presidential candidates that you've got running in this country, because they're doing the same thing.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I don't name any names, but what I'm saying is that religion and politics mix naturally, and we shouldn't worry about it if it is done in a constitutional framework. If there's a constitutional mechanism to guarantee the rights of citizens and to affirm majority rule and protection of minority rights, then we should not worry. And if people want to talk in the language of the book of Deuteronomy or Isaiah or the teachings of Jesus, that's fine, and we shouldn't, or the Quran. And as long as there's a constitutional mechanism to translate those ethical values of religion into political mechanisms based on citizenship. And this is the key word.
This constitutional mechanism you speak of does not exist in the Arab world right now. It has to be created. And so let me ask
that's what they're doing.
This is exactly. And this is I'm not liking how my brain is formulating this question, but I'm going to go for it anyway, and you can say that's not the right question. But what role, the US has considerable experience in democracy, in shaping a democracy. As you've just pointed out. What role can the U.S. play in assisting the building of democracy without becoming paternalistic? Well,
that's a very important question, which we deal with all the time in the Middle East, and talking about not just the Arab world, but in Turkey and Iran and other places, people saying, well, what should the Europeans and the Americans and the Russians do? I think the first thing they should do
and part of this question is also, is there something that the Arab world, and I know it's not monolithic, wants from the U.S. and the European and Europeans in terms of that kind of support, or would they rather just figure it out themselves?
Well, the answer is to both questions. Absolutely, people want to interact with the West and in a deep manner, in politics, economics, technology, culture, in all fields. There's a strong affinity to the Western world. What the West should do is essentially, again, with humility, and here we're at a Catholic school, and if you go back and read the Bible, after faith in God, humility is one of the biggest values that are taught in all three Abrahamic faiths, to be humble, not just humble before God, but humble before your fellow human beings. And the first thing that people should do going into the region is ask the people of the region, what do they want? What do they want from us in the United States? What do they want from Europe? Not to go in assuming that you know what they want. And then that'll help define that linkage, that point of intersection where what the Arabs want, or even others. One day in the future, you'll be doing this with the Iranians. When Iran evolves, you're doing it with the Turks now in a democratic Turkey. Ask them what they want, and then find those points where what you have to offer and what they would like from you actually intersect. There are huge things, including some things in the political sphere. For instance, I would argue your judicial system, despite its flaws, is one of the most impressive things that you have in this country. The constitutional mechanisms to guarantee the rule of law are very impressive. It took you a long time to work them through, over a couple of centuries. So there are areas where your traditions, your expertise is useful. I wouldn't go to the state of Florida and ask for help in election ballots, but there are many things that we can ask the United States for legitimately.
Well, perhaps if you know any election observers from the Middle East who'd be willing to help us in 2012.
Yeah, exactly.
I wonder, you're famously optimistic in your approach to these issues, but I wonder if you believe that the U.S. State Department is actually capable of that stance of humility, of going in and saying, of not going in and in a blustering fashion and saying, here's what you should do, but actually coming in and saying, is there any way we can help?
According to the way the U.S. has behaved in recent years, there's not much sign of that, but there is one positive sign. I think the American response, the American government's response to the Arab revolts that are taking place now, I think is quite heartening, because in the beginning, in December, January, February, the United States was completely confused and baffled. They didn't quite know how to deal with free Arabs. They've never had an experience of dealing with millions of Arabs who were revolting for their freedom. But then I think 3 months into the process, the U.S., Obama's team and others realized that the best thing to do is just lie low and pull back and let this process run its course, and let the United States simply articulate certain principles that it supports of democratic constitutionalism, social justice, rule of law, majority rule, minority rights, etc. And that's, I think, so we have a little indication that the U.S. now is learning that, in fact, it doesn't have to take the lead on these things. It can be in the background and help where people ask it to be helpful.
Does the U.S.'s support of the nation of Israel complicate their ability to offer assistance to Arab nations?
It shouldn't. There shouldn't be a contradiction between the U.S. supporting the security of the State of Israel within its 1967 borders. You can support Israel as strongly and as much as you want, and be supportive of Palestinian and Arab rights. The problem becomes when the U.S. seems to be supporting or acquiescing in Israeli colonization and expansion of settlements beyond the 67 borders, and all of the other things that Israel is doing that are clearly criticized in international law, like mass detentions, siege of Gaza, etc., etc. That's the problem. So the U.S. needs to really clarify that it is strongly supportive of Israel, and that is a perfectly legitimate policy that most of the world would agree with, but doesn't support Israeli colonial expansion and aggression against Palestinians, or, for instance, the annexation of the Golan Heights of Syria, to draw that distinction. Obama tried to do it with the settlements. He tried to pressure the Israelis and got absolutely nowhere and caved in the end. And this is why the U.S. has become totally marginalized. So if the U.S. is seen to be acquiescing in or actively supporting Israeli colonization, then it's a huge problem, because the Arabs simply won't even talk to the U.S. And you've seen it recently with the president of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, going to the UN and asking the UN to deal with this issue, because the Palestinians don't trust the United States anymore. They don't want to deal with it. And the U.S. has marginalized itself, not only with the Palestinians. The strange and difficult thing for Americans is to realize that with the four key actors in the region, Iranians, Arabs, Israelis, and Turks, the United States has almost zero influence. It's really startling. And the U.S. in the last 4 or 5 years in different arenas has tried to pressure all four of these players, and to pressure them, to ask them to do something, to threaten them, to cajole them, to entice them. And in all four cases, the Iranians, the Arabs, the Israelis, and the Turks pushed back and told the United States, we don't want to do what you want us to do, and get out of here. And the United States retreated like a helpless giant. It's a very unusual situation for the world's most powerful country to be the weakest player in the Middle East, even if it has its army there and it's giving billions of dollars and doing all that it does. So I think this is an issue the U.S. has to solve. It's not only because of its bias towards Israel, it's because of its inability to apply consistently and equitably the principles of the rule of law that it claims are the driving forces of its own policy.
In a few moments, we're going to invite questions from the audience, but before we do, I'm going to read you a question that was submitted online at theciviccommons.com. Christine Morgan wrote, I find it interesting how social media is changing how we communicate. Instead of saying, however, what role does technology and social media play in all the uprisings, parenthetically, because we know that it played a role and helped people organize, my question, she writes, is how can we use social media to ease cultural tensions? Is that possible?
I think it probably is possible, but it's going to take time for people to figure that out. Up to now, social media have been used for two primary purposes, and we've done research on this in the Arab world from our professors at AUB, including one professor who got his PhD at Kent State, Professor Jad Milky, researching how young people use social media in the Arab world. And up to now, social media have done two things. They've allowed people to express themselves. People who didn't have voice were allowed to, found a way to get their voices out there. And the second thing, it allowed people to sort of connect with each other in a kind of mobilization for protests in the street, for organizing some kind of movement. Initially, digitally on Facebook and on the web, and then people would go out into the street for demonstrations. Social media hasn't made that last move into the realm of conflict resolution or to ease tensions, into being a political actor or a political arena where tensions can be addressed and resolved. That can happen, but it cannot happen mainly through social media. Social media can only be an adjunct to human face-to-face contacts between people.
But don't you think, I mean, it could happen. I mean, in the US, we've seen the It Gets Better project, where people were recording videos of themselves. This is to help kids who are being bullied because of their sexuality. And they would record videos of themselves and say, it's hard now, but it gets better. But could you imagine young people in Jerusalem and young people in Gaza recording videos of themselves and uploading it to YouTube saying, you know, we want peace, we want a two-state solution, and here's why.
You know, there is a bit of that going on, but it has had very little impact. And because the overriding sentiments on both sides are sentiments of fear, of vulnerability, of anger, of revenge, they're not sentiments that bring people together.
There's no empathy.
No empathy. And people have tried to bring people together either through like summer camps or on the web, and they've done that, and people have connected, and they get along fine for those few days they're together, but it has zero impact on the political system, and that's what you need.
Okay, we're going to pause for a moment for the mid-program announcements from Pete Moore.
Today at St. Ignatius High School, we are listening to a special City Club forum featuring Rami Khouri, director of the Issam Ferris Institute of Public Policy at the American University of Beirut, and hosted by Dan Malthrop of the Civic Commons. We will return to our speaker in a few minutes for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening on WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS, IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. In 2012, the City Club of Cleveland will turn 100 years old. We are planning a number of events and will likely be actively soliciting support from the community through our campaign for a new century. Our celebration will begin on October 10th, next Monday, with the conference on free speech at the Allen Theater. For more information about our upcoming forums, please refer to our website, www.cityclub.org, and to learn more about the 100th anniversary events, visit the 100th anniversary tab on our website. Now we would like to return to our speaker and Dan for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today is City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and Noel Celeste of Civic Commons.
Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Approximately 3 weeks ago, the Palestinian ambassador was in town, and he said, Moeen Atakat is his name, and he said that the Palestinians have over 130 votes in support at the United Nations. And as we're well aware, America is probably going to veto this. Do you think by America's continuous support for Israel and vetoing the Palestinians to have a 194th state, that this is going to affect the American credibility in the Arab world?
I think for sure if the U.S. vetoes the Security Council resolution on UN recognition of Palestinian statehood, it would be a negative move for America's position in the Arab world, and not just in the Arab world, and probably most of the world. But this is likely to happen. If it comes to a vote, the U.S. said it's going to veto it. We know that. So the question, I think, becomes, is there an alternative? Is there something else that the United States could do, or others could do? For the moment, there isn't, because the Palestinians insist on going to the UN simply because they've given up with the 20 years of American-mediated direct Israeli-Palestinian talks, which have gotten nowhere. You will hear arguments from both sides. The Israelis have their arguments, the Palestinians have their arguments. So you should listen to the arguments of both sides and then make up your mind. Most of the world, having listened to the Israelis and the Palestinians, comes down closer to the Palestinians, saying that the Israelis have been intransigent. They haven't really made it clear that they're prepared to comply with the dictates of international law that are needed for a permanent resolution. The U.S. is very much with Israel on this question, and you have the U.S. and Israel quite isolated now diplomatically on this question. This is not a good situation for anybody, because the Arab-Israeli conflict needs direct American involvement for any kind of permanent solution, because the Israelis will only trust the Americans. They won't deal with anybody else. So it's a bit of a dilemma how to break this. I think the way to break it is to be more rigorous in terms of identifying what are the actual real bottom line rights and needs of the Israelis, and what are the bottom line rights and needs of the Palestinians, and how can you address those simultaneously. That hasn't been really applied. The approach that's been applied so far has been that Israel has to have its security guaranteed and its settlements continue, and then the Palestinians will see what they get. It's been a distorted political process, and it hasn't worked. So I think we have to look for something that's more equitable, and the U.S. vetoing the UN resolution will be just one more short-term push for reduced American credibility in the region, but it's already so low that it's not going to be anything significant.
Does there need to be a new mediator? Does the U.S. need to step aside and let somebody with more credibility?
Yes, but the problem is the Israelis won't trust anybody but the U.S. So what you need to do is to expand the mediation process into some kind of UN forum where you have the rule international law and legitimacy as the criteria for conflict resolution, and to apply those criteria fairly to the Israelis and to the Palestinians and the other Arabs, so that everybody has to play by the same rules and apply the same laws.
Does this new coalition, the Quartet, do they stand any chance?
No. That was attempted, but it turned out to be just a fig leaf for American domination of the process. The Quartet's positions have been very much mirroring American positions, which are very much close to Israeli positions. So the Quartet has proved to be lacking credibility and therefore is not taken seriously. You need some kind of new combination of powers, and you could see something like the U.S., the Russians, maybe the Turks, maybe the South Africans stepping in together to mediate a process that has more credibility. So I think something like that is likely to happen.
Let's get another question.
My question for you is the changes that has taken place in the Arab world, but specifically regarding Syria, where the brutal crackdown is taking place, and then talking the same way what happened in Bahrain and what's going on in Yemen, there seems to be a Saudi movement to try to stop this from growing any further. What's your thought, and how long can Syrian government continue to kill its own people and get away with it?
There definitely is a Saudi-led reaction to the Arab freedom movement and the Arab citizen revolt across the region, and it is having impact in Bahrain clearly, where the government of Bahrain, with strong Saudi and American and other support, has kind of stalled the demonstrations. But the problem is still there, hasn't gone away. There's still a majority of Bahrainis who want to be treated more equitably and more fairly by their own government. So I think the lesson is that you can hold off these demands for freedoms. And the Russians did the same thing in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And we've seen this in the past, where a big power goes into a country where there is a popular demonstration for democracy and freedom, and with its military might stops that process. It stops it for a few years and then it resumes. Because the will for freedom and democracy expressed by millions and millions of citizens in their own country is an unstoppable force. It cannot be stopped. Military might, buying them off economically, threatening them politically, will not stop this force. It's an indomitable force, and it has been the great driving force for human civilization for thousands and thousands of years, that people want to be able to live as free human beings who can manifest their humanity in terms of their culture, their making money, business, agriculture, travel, reading, speaking, debating, enjoying music, just normal basic human functions. They want to exercise their humanity. It's not an ideological struggle. It's a struggle for human decency and to be able to manifest all of their God-given talents as human beings. And governments can suppress this for a while, but they can't suppress it forever. And so I think we'll see this process continue across the Arab world. Syria is a case where there is, again, a strong government military response, but the popular resistance to the government is equally strong. We have a bit of a stalemate, same as in Yemen. This will go on for some months, and then my prediction in Syria is that you'll get the economic underpinnings of the regime will wither away, and that will trigger some kind of political transformation. In Yemen, probably the transition will happen in the next couple of months, and in Bahrain, it'll take much longer. There's still two areas where different rules apply than the rest of the world. One is when you get close to oil, the other is when you get close to Israel. So in those two areas, you will get different rules applying. And we're seeing it in Bahrain, and in Israel, we're seeing it in terms of what's happening with the Syrians. So people don't want a revolution in Syria because partly they're worried about what does this mean for Israel's security. So, and this gets us back to the problem of double standards, that if you apply different rules for different people because of oil or because of Israel or because of some other reason around the world, you're going to be accused of hypocrisy and double standards, and that's exactly what's going on. The thrust of the Arab revolt is to stop these double standards and to have a system of government and law and the exercise of power that is anchored on the basis of equal rights for all people. It's a bit romantic, but so was Paul Revere. Romanticism is something that that rings loudly with people all over the world.
Next question.
Sir, since you're based in Lebanon and it's sort of related to Syria, I wanted to know what your opinion is of the stability of the Lebanon government, and particularly with the involvement now of Hezbollah in some of the activities, and the relationship with Syria, since Syria had for a long time dominated Lebanon with their military and may still have influence.
The Syrian-Lebanese relationship has always been a difficult one because of the imbalance in power, and there's historical issues, and now it's been much more complicated by the growth of Hezbollah as a very powerful, the most powerful group in the country, politically and militarily, and it exercises its military power outside the control of the Lebanese government, and this is a problem for many Lebanese who now openly challenge Hezbollah. But Hezbollah is closely allied to Syria and to Iran, and this creates further levels of complication. Hezbollah has also been engaged in Lebanese politics for the last, I think, around 15 years. They've been running for parliament, and they're in the cabinet. So they're in the government, but they're also militarily, they keep their power outside the government. So it's a very bizarre, unusual situation, which is also not sustainable. And many Lebanese now have openly challenged Hezbollah in a way that they wouldn't have done 10 years ago. Hezbollah is credited with leading the resistance that drove the Israeli occupation out of South Lebanon after almost 20 years they were there. And so Hezbollah has huge respect and legitimacy, but also now has generated a political backlash against it among, I would say, half the people of Lebanon. So if Syria changes, if there's a change of regime, or if it becomes a more democratic country, and Syria's links with Iran evolve, Syria's links with Hezbollah might evolve, these are all big questions for Lebanon. We don't have, nobody knows exactly how this is going to play itself out, but it's certain that Syria will change in a significant manner in the coming year or two, I think. This will impact on relations with Hezbollah and Iran. This will force Hezbollah to come up with a political response to its new conditions. And I think this is going to force Hezbollah to come to grips with the issue that it has always tried to avoid, which is that it has to make that ultimate shift from being a military resistance movement to being a political empowerment movement. For Shiites, but also for all Lebanese. It has a lot of credibility in many ways, and people in this country only hear of Hezbollah because it fires missiles at Israel, and therefore...
People notice that sort of stuff.
Pardon?
I said people notice that sort of stuff.
Right, and they do fire missiles at Israel because Israel occupied South Lebanon for many years and continues to overfly and do many things. But so there's a war. There's a war between Hezbollah and Israel, or there used to be between Lebanon and Israel. In the context of war, people fire missiles at each other. But Hezbollah does other things besides fighting Israel, and this is why it's so strong and has such legitimacy. But it needs to resolve a bit of a dilemma, which is a schizophrenic sense of, is it only a military resistance movement against Israel? Is it mainly a social empowerment movement? Is it a welfare agency for Lebanese?
Can I ask a clarifying question about Hezbollah? Is the fact that they're armed in violation of the Lebanese constitution?
Well, it's in violation of the Lebanese constitution, but the Lebanese government has repeatedly affirmed that it supports the resistance that Hezbollah represents. So it's this gray zone, which is, it's like I said, many Lebanese now openly challenge it. So people are not comfortable with the fact that it's armed and outside the control of the Lebanese government. But it is a situation that's gray. It's not.
Could Hezbollah gain more credibility then by disarming and is supporting the Lebanese military, so turning over that responsibility to the government?
Well, they're not going to disarm. What they're going to do, ultimately, I believe, is mesh their military power with the Lebanese government, armed forces, into one unit, which is under the control of the Lebanese government, in which they'll probably play a leading role. I think it's inevitable that they've got to make that transition. They see themselves as a resistance movement. They see themselves as a resistance movement that resists not only Israeli military attacks against Lebanon and occupation and subjugation, etc., but they also see themselves as a political resistance movement that fights foreign penetration in the region. They criticize American, European, other political moves in the region. So they have this broader mandate that they give themselves, which is not very credible across the board. But their military resistance to Israel has been very successful, and they're also a Shiite empowerment movement. They started in the late 60s, early 70s, before Israel actually occupied South Lebanon, and their main driving force was to pick up this Shiite community in Lebanon, which was treated like third-class citizens. They were treated like African Americans were treated here in the 1940s. They were really abused and treated with disdain and with great lack of rights. And so they had this tremendous success in picking up this Shiite community, which is now the most powerful one in Lebanon. And they're very efficient. People admire them at one level for being they don't have any serious record of corruption. They're very efficient in delivering social services. So they do many other things besides fighting Israeli occupation. And that's why they have credibility. But they've been doing many different things. I think they need to, as they mature politically, they need to define their political place more clearly.
Let's take a question over here.
I was reading the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago, and it had an interesting article about two big players in the Middle East, and they were Iran and Saudi Arabia, and how they have their own sort of Cold War going on now. How exactly do you think the situation is going to play out in the Middle East, especially with Iran, because their influence is growing rapidly?
Iran and Saudi Arabia are two major players in the region that are involved in a kind of ideological Cold War to a large extent. And what you see in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Yemen, and Somalia, and many places in Iraq, you see this behind the scenes. The Saudis are helping some people and the Iranians are helping other people. Some people talk about this as a Sunni-Shiite conflict, which I think is vastly exaggerated. There are elements of that, but this is really about Iranian and Arab nationalisms clashing in some ways. The Saudis don't like the Iranian Revolution of '79 that overthrew the Shah, sparking Islamist movements all across the Arab world, Sunni Islamist movements that were insurrectionary or revolutionary in nature and tried to challenge regimes. There's many reasons why the Saudis don't like what the Iranians are doing and what Iran represents as an ideology in the region. And the Saudis are now actively pushing back against Iran, as are some other people in the Arab world. So in the short run, it is a factor, this kind of Cold War between them. But in the long run, I don't think it's going to be a major defining dynamic in our region. As the Arab transformations for democratic change become more and more successful, Iran's influence in the region will become much more marginal. And the critical recent development that's happened is that Turkey has stepped into the Middle East as a much more dominant player, as somebody that's not Arab but is Muslim. But being Muslim is really pretty irrelevant. I mean, people don't follow Turkey or Iran because they're Muslim. They follow them because they're powerful countries that take positions that people like. So Turkey now is the more important external regional player in the Arab world, whether in Arab relations or Arab-Israeli issues or dealing with the West or whatever it may be.
Is that because of Turkey's status as a democracy?
As a democracy, as a thriving economy, and as a nation ruled by law, and as a nation that speaks out for and is seen to represent justice and the rule of law. Whether it's in Gaza or in Syria or in Libya or wherever it may be, the Turks have this image in the Arab world, which is quite an accurate one, of actually being powerful but being fair. And that combination of power and justice is a very compelling one. And the Turks have been able to do it in a way that nobody else has in the region.
Yes, thank you for appearing today. I was in Beirut in the old days, so I welcome you to Cleveland. In the news this morning was the Russian and Chinese veto of the resolution in the Security Council condemning Syria for its brutality for its own people. And Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, got up on her high horse and started talking about the immorality of stopping a resolution to condemn this. But I read her script. Had it been applied to the U.S. veto of the Goldstone report and of our failure to condemn the Israeli brutality in Gaza as more of your hypocrisy, and it strikes me that Syria's only killed 2,000 people in a very, very big population. Israel killed almost 2,000 people, 1,400, and the American people didn't care that many Palestinians were actually murdered in a massacre. So with your knowledge of American history, do you think this hypocrisy is a crisis for American culture? You know your history going back to Paul Revere, so I hold you can come to this country and tell me what you think about the crisis in our American political system and our culture for our hypocrisy. 100 votes in the U.S. Senate, always for Israel.
Well, I think the first thing about hypocrisy is that it's a normal operating system for any politician, unfortunately, all over the world. Politicians react to power. They don't react to morality. But when they can combine power and morality, then they become statesmen and stateswomen. They become great people. If they can't, they use one or the other. So normal hypocrisy is something that we know that all governments use it. And the United States has used it a lot in the Middle East. And this is the example you give is a very good one. The question is, at what point does that start to hurt the U.S.? Does the United States feel any consequences of a double standard? So it supports strong enforcement of UN resolutions against Iran, or to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait when they were there. but it doesn't do anything about UN resolutions that tell the Israelis to get out of the Golan Heights or to stop the siege of Gaza or to stop Judaizing Jerusalem. So there's a double standard that is very clear, and people are reacting to it. The United States hasn't yet felt the consequences of its policies. The U.S. broadly...
Wait. 9/11?
That is a consequence of a criminal act by a small group of people.
But not a consequence of U.S. foreign policy.
Well, it certainly, for those criminals who attacked the United States, they would argue that they did this because of what the U.S. is doing. So that was one incident which hasn't been repeated. The damage done by the United States in the Middle East and Asia with its policies is far greater than 9/11 or anything that was done here. I mean, the 9/11 was a traumatic thing. I was here when it happened. I was in Boston. There was a great trauma and it was a great crime. And the United States, you know, was shaken by this. And still to this day, the U.S., I think, broadly as a society, isn't quite clear about why it happened, who these people are, what do they want, and more importantly, how do we deal with this kind of criminal attack. But there is a link, but broadly speaking, the United States hasn't paid any serious price for its policies and therefore feels that it can go on like this as it is going on. So it does it in Bahrain or in Syria or wherever. But this is an issue that is political in nature. If the price becomes too high, the government will change its policies. I mean, governments in the final analysis have to be realistic, and they need to do what is possible. And if the United States starts to really feel a backlash and starts to suffer from its policies, for instance, if you get, you know, Arab wealth funds taking out, you know, trillions of their dollars out of American investments, that would hurt. It's not going to happen, but something like that would hurt. So I think we just have to keep pointing out these double standards, but we need to point them out wherever they happen. And it's not only the Americans who do double standards. The Israelis do it, the Europeans do it, and the Arabs do it themselves. We have to, if we are asking for justice and fairness in American foreign policy, we have to ask it among all the foreign policies of the people. And this is where I think the critical challenge for all of us is to be activists in asking for the rule of law and democracy and justice for everybody applied equally, and not to make the mistakes that the Americans and the Israelis have done, which is say that Israel has greater rights and then the Arabs get their rights. If the Israelis get their rights, then the Arabs will get their rights. We don't want to repeat that by saying the Americans have to stop being hypocritical and then we'll stop being hypocritical. No, we need to say hypocrisy has to stop as an operating system for politics, and justice and law and democracy need to be implemented across the board. If we can do it simultaneously, that's the best way.
Let's take another question.
Regarding the demonstrations in Bahrain, these people were brutally murdered and put down by the authorities. And recently, the medical people that attended to them were sentenced to long jail terms, including a prominent surgeon trained in the Royal College of Surgeons. Got 15 years in jail. The United States is totally mute on this. I got that online from The Guardian. You go to, if you want to know what's going on, you got to go to the British papers online. So my point is...
I read the Daily Star.
Well, my point is the American media is complicit in this. Totally. There was no report on this, none whatsoever.
I think,
and my question is, again, of course, following up on this judgment, what eventually is going to happen in the United States when we're subject to this hypocrisy and double standard? What's going to happen to our own democracy?
You're right, and I think the answer is the antidote to a distortion of democracy in the United States, which is a skewed policy that is unfair to some people in the Middle East. The antidote is better democracy. In other words, citizens here have to agitate. If you think that your media is giving you bad coverage, you need to constantly tell that to the media, and the media ultimately will will respond. If your politicians are taking actions that you think are outrageous, you've got to keep telling them that. At some point, they will respond. They may not respond immediately, but one of the great things about democracies is they have self-correcting mechanisms, that if they go too far in one direction, they can be brought back to a more just and a more reasonable position. But when we're dealing with issues like Bahrain, you're dealing with oil. And oil and Israel, as I said, are the two issues that are handled with different rule books. There's a different set of rules for Israel and oil in American foreign policy dictates. Now, I would argue this is wrong. This is not fair. This is un-American. It's undemocratic. It's unjust. It's also unsustainable. But we'll have to see. When the Arab world becomes more democratic, you're already seeing in Egypt, for instance, a change, a pushback against the Israelis. They're not going to go back to war with Israel, but they're going to demand that the Israelis start treating the Egyptians with a bit more dignity and fairness, and stop being so aggressive and predatory. And if you get democracies all across the Arab world acting in a different way, this might bring about some change.
Let's squeeze in one last question.
Hi. If Abbas and the Palestinian people truly want peace and
Pardon?
If Abbas and the Palestinian people truly want peace and an establishment of their own state, why didn't Abbas accept the invitation by Netanyahu after the speech in the UN to start up negotiations right then and there, or even the quartet's established a proposed plan to start up negotiations in the next year?
Because the Palestinians, Abbas and the Palestinians, have been negotiating with the Israelis for almost 20 years, nonstop. Almost, I think, 19 and a half years. And they have not been able to get from the Israelis sufficient agreement to making changes in Israeli policies that would allow for a comprehensive peace to happen. So they know that they feel that the current Israeli position is not serious about a really negotiated comprehensive peace. Netanyahu is a very eloquent huckster, I believe, and I use that word huckster deliberately. It's a strong word. He's a snake oil salesman when it comes to politics in the Middle East, and he sounds wonderful at the UN. Let's sit down and negotiate right now. It sounds very good. And we are in the same building. Let us sit here and talk right now. It sounds very nice. Well, the Palestinians have been negotiating for 20 years with the Israelis, and the Israelis simply haven't reached the point where they're prepared to make the changes in their policies that the world is telling them they have to make to achieve that peace. So that's the main reason why they haven't said that. And the Palestinians have responded to virtually every Israeli and American demand that has been made of them in terms of stopping violence, in terms of accepting that some of the big Israeli settlements around Jerusalem will remain part of Israel, for land swaps. They've made every concession that's been asked of them, and they haven't yet gotten from the Israelis the reciprocal concessions that need to be made on issues of land and water control, real sovereignty, settlements, and most importantly, Jerusalem and refugees. They're moving closer together over the years, but there's still that big last hurdle to make, and that's why the Palestinians didn't accept that very, PR-ish kind of gesture that Netanyahu making. And the quartet also, their offer, their call is seen to be wildly lacking in credibility and in balance. It's just the same old stuff. Let's sit down, let's talk, let's address the core issues. But we've done that for 20 years. And after 20 years, you have a track record of failure that is really compelling. And that's what the Palestinians were responding to. They want a different negotiating context in which the rule of law is applied to both sides.
We have to wrap, and there are obviously many questions that all of you have. You're all invited to continue the conversation at theciviccommons.com/new perspectives. The professors who are involved, Pete, Neda, and Josh, will all also be online very regularly to engage with you there. And you're all invited to join the Naknees Book Club, which is going to be reading Toby Jones' new book, Desert Kingdom, in anticipation of his visit as part of the speaker series in December. And I think Pete's probably going to say something else about the next event as well, the next events in November. Also, but while I still got your attention, on your way out, be sure to fill out those surveys that were inside your programs, because they'll go a long way to helping us shape future programs. Pete Moore, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
And Rami Khouri, please.
Today at St. Ignatius High School, we've been listening to a City Club forum featuring Rami Khouri, editor-at-large for the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper, and moderated by our own Dan Malthorpe of the Civic Commons. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.